Hello and welcome to the podcast edition of the Young Conservation Scientist Conference 2017. My name is Sian Douglas and I'll be presenting the 5 podcasts in this series. The Young Conservation Scientist Conference is a 3-day event at the Saranuri University of Technology in Thailand. It has brought together like-minded people, all with the hope of conserving the fauna and flora of Southeast Asia. We were fortunate enough to have received talks from some of the leading conservation and research experts in the region. The audio of each talk has been recorded, so I'm delighted to be able to share these with you today. In this podcast, you will be able to listen to the talk given at the conference, and at the end I'll discuss the questions asked by the audience with the speaker. Delivering the first plenary talk at the conference was Associate Professor Dr. Alice Hughes. Alice leads the Landscape Ecology Group at Xishuangbanna Tropical Botanical Gardens in China, as well as holding board positions on the Asian section of the Society of Conservation Biology, the International Network of Next Generation Ecologists, and the European Tropical Ecology Society. Dr. Colin Strine, one of the event organisers, believes Alice truly embodies the Young Conservation Scientist Conference, as she is young, a conservationist, and a scientist. Alice's passion for conservation is truly infectious, so I hope you enjoy her talk as much as we did.
So as I wait for the start of my slides, it'd be great if we could get the projector working. The future is in all of your hands, and over the next 50 minutes or so, I'll show you quite why this region is such a global priority for conservation. And why it isn't in the hands of Caucasians like me. I grew up in the UK. This is not my region. However long I spend here, I will never be able to appreciate in the same way that you can the socio-cultural context. Because not only can you guys be fantastic scientists, but you can understand how things work in your own countries. And those are the things that are key to implementing conservation science. So let's think about the world and what it needs. Well, we need to satisfy the demands of an ever-growing human population. Some of you may have heard of something called the planetary boundaries, and that is a set of these 8 different categories, and if we could dim the lights, that would be fantastic. These 8 global categories, and if humans bypass any one of those, basically we don't have a future, because humans depend on biodiversity. And of course, biodiversity depends on not being overutilised by humans. But you'll see that 2 of those are right up to the edge. And that's the biodiversity and integrity over here, as well as biogeochemical flows, so things like climate change here. So I'm going to be concentrating on this one, the biosphere integrity. Now, overall our lifespans, this planet has changed. And if we look over the last century or so, this is what human population growth has done. So this is 1800, and this is 1900. And you can see that the human population of the Earth has changed an enormous amount in a very short time period. And if you talk to most people on Earth, they'll say the main problem for biodiversity is there's too many people. But if we go into the future, you can see those projections of what will happen next are very, very variable. As humans have less children, we may actually see decreases in human population. However, what has also changed as the population has grown is our individual footprints, and our consumption has also grown. Diets have changed, and this shows changing diets since 1960 to present. And you've got a whole lot of different regions there. But you can see for the Asian region and South Asia in particular, these 2, we've seen massive changes in calorific change, but also we've seen global changes on what we're eating. For example, China's diet, and I live in China, has increased over 680% in the amount of oil consumed, over 350% increase in the amount of meat consumed, and about 300% increase in the amount of sugar consumed. And that's per capita. And in fact, almost wherever you go in the world, and I apologise you can't read this, each of these is a country,
and it's showing how the amount we've eaten as individuals has changed. And on average, it's increased by about 1,000 calories, so about a third every day. And to satisfy that, requires an increasing amount of land. So let's have a look at some of those crops. So these are some of the crops that have changed the most in terms of consumption. And among those, soy and oil palm, and you can see that up here. The crop that has changed the most in global demand is soybeans, and oil palm is the third. And both of those come from tropical areas. And both of them are attributed to causing more clearance of rainforest than any other crop. The soybean is predominantly for feeding animals, because meat consumption, in terms of biodiversity, is enormously expensive, because the concentrated soybeans that they require in order to actually feed them requires a massive amount more land. So let's think about the impacts that these changing patterns of consumption have on this planet, as we have that increasingly demanding and increasingly large human population. So this is a map of the world, and this is based on IUCN data of threatened mammals. And what you'll notice is for the world's mammals, there is one area where you have more threatened species than any other part of the planet. Let's have a little look at that. So this is a map of the anurans. Each of these pie charts has different colours denoting the number of threatened species. So you'll see that Southeast Asia has more threatened anurans than any other part of the planet. The same for the certiodactyls. You'll see that all of these pie charts here show that we have a lot of threatened certiodactyl species. The same for the insectivores and for the primates. The carnivores and the bats are also not doing well. So almost every taxonomic group we look at, and here it is for all the mammals, so you'll see in places like Indonesia, over half the mammal species are either threatened or data deficient. And whatever group we look at, so the hawks, the ducks, the barbets, even things like the bustards, we don't have many species, but they're all critically endangered. So why is it that this region has so many threatened species? Well, as you saw on one of the first slides, rubber and oil palm has a greater and greater demand. It's one of the crops that's increased in demand more than any other area. And this is the growth of oil palm in this region. And you'll see that in the 1960s there was almost nothing, whereas now there's an absolutely huge area. And if we split that into the main producing countries, so we've got Indonesia, we've got Malaysia, and we've got Papua New Guinea, the amount being produced is growing year on year. And in fact, if we look at global production, you'll see that between Indonesia and Malaysia, it accounts for about 90% of the world's oil palm. Now, I can pretty much guarantee that almost every one of you will have used oil palm today. It's in toothpaste, it's in shower gel, it's in all of our foods. But it's not actually good for us. It's a cheap oil which is used to make mass-produced everything. But that commodification of food and the fact that increasingly people don't really know what they're consuming or using has a massive and devastating effect on these areas. And this is how the consumption has grown. So again, this is Indonesia and Malaysia, and this is the whole rest of the world. So that global demand for oil palm is being satisfied by predominantly just those two countries. Now, many of you might have heard of the RSPO. You may have heard of Indonesia's moratorium on deforestation. But the problem is that enforcing these things is tremendously difficult. And though we've tried to improve standards, the world is, by and large, fairly unaware of what's happening in these regions. So though green rubber and RSPO are fantastic ideas, the actual implementation has been very, very challenging. We also know that unlike South America, selective logging has been less successful at maintaining biodiversity in the Southeast Asian region. And that these logging trails not only have a devastating effect on biodiversity by increasing hunting, but also allow further deforestation. So in December, this paper came out by Ibish et al. And it was basically measuring global distances to roads, with these blue areas meant to be a huge distance from a road. And I looked at this paper and I thought, that's not the Southeast Asia I know. So I wrote a short letter to Science, but in addition I thought, okay, if this is based on a global map of roads, why are there so many roads unmapped in Southeast Asia? And how many roads in this region are unmapped? So let's zoom in on this region. So what I did is created 150 grids, and within each of those I digitized all of the roads. Those red lines, those red solid squares, are unmapped roads. And if we zoom into somewhere like Kalimantan, you can see that these grid cells are covered in these unmapped logging roads. If we look at the figures, it's startling. What we see is in areas like Papua New Guinea, you only have about 60% of the roads that are unmapped. Whereas in Malaysia, so Sabah and Sarawak, almost 90% of those roads are unmapped. And if you split these areas into different regions, you can see that places like Gorontalo and Sulawesi have 97% of their roads not on any global map. And this is predominantly because these roads are recently created in order to log those areas and to produce oil palm. Unfortunately, that means a lot of things that are very bad for biodiversity. It means that almost half of each of these areas is within just 2.5 kilometres of a road. And if you want to see what these areas look like, and I'm sorry you can't see the contrast here, every one of those grid squares is just covered in these roads. And in fact, when you map all of the roads in this area, the average distance to roads drops to under a tenth of what it is calculated using global databases. And this isn't all illegal. We all seem to think that Indonesia and Malaysia are trying to stop deforestation, but this is a map of legal concessions that are actually being provided by the government to turn into oil palm or rubber or other forms of concession. So you'll see the whole of Sarawak here is basically just covered in legal concessions. Let's have a little bit more of a look at those figures. So when we look at the distances, on average it drops from over 21 kilometres to under 6. And what we see is basically when we look in close proximity to these roads, the amount of deforestation changes dramatically. So some areas like Kalimantan Penge, the average distance drops from over 30 kilometres to under 1 kilometre on average from a road in all of those areas. And almost 90% of deforestation is within 2.5 kilometres of a road. So the fact that almost all of the areas we mapped, so 150 squares, the average distance is under that 2.5 kilometres, means that the amount of deforestation is changing dramatically. And even in places like Papua New Guinea, those roads are being created very, very fast. But let's think about what this means. So the black areas here show areas that Hansen et al. On the global database mapped as forest. Unfortunately, when we then look at the satellite data, and all these white lines represent unmapped roads, and the red areas represent recent deforestation, generally for oil palm plantations, we see that this is a genuine pattern, and that deforestation is happening very rapidly. But what's even more terrifying, so these figures here, each different colour is a different country. This is the amount of deforestation taking place, and here is the year. The actual area deforested each year in each of these countries is increasing. So not just the percentage change, the rate of deforestation is increasing. And if we decide to look and say, okay, well, if I have 100% of forests here in 2001, what percentage of that has been lost by 2014? So for two countries here, Sabah and Sarawak, for Sarawak and part of Kalimantan, the forest in just that 13-year period is almost halved. And if we look at the exports from these countries, so this is all exports from Indonesia, a huge proportion of them are dependent on things that cause deforestation. And if we look at all of the exports from Indonesia in a slightly more complicated way, so this is a network of impacts, The largest export is palm oil, forming by briquettes, but they're also correlated with inequality. So the money that's generated by producing oil palm and coal in these cases often does not get to the local level. Much of that money goes to global exporters, so people on the local level are not better off. This money is not reaching them, because this is based on what we call the Gini index. So what's the prognosis for much of Indonesia and Malaysia? You just saw that in just that 40 years, the forest cover of 2 of those areas had decreased to almost half. And this, for those of you who don't know, is Java. Each of those red areas represents a protected area. In Java, the only forest left is protected areas. Here is Kalimantan, and you can already see the same pattern is happening. This is the deforestation that has occurred in just that 14-year period. What the data tells us is within the next 5 to 7 years, much of the Indo-Malaysian region will probably become like Java, with the only remaining forest within protected areas. Now, we already know from analysis of the whole of the Southeast Asian region that for much of this area, the only mammals over 2.5 kilograms, so basically anything bigger than a porcupine, is largely in protected areas. We know that in places like Myanmar, there is only 7% protected area coverage. So we need to get a whole lot more proactive about making sure the right areas are protected, but also ensuring that we try a lot harder to slow these rates of deforestation. Now, I've been talking largely about Indonesia and Malaysia so far. How about the rest of Asia? Well, unfortunately, the rest of Asia is variable, but not that much better. The annual deforestation rates vary between about 1 and 5%. But unfortunately, that means that over that time period, areas like Cambodia have almost half their forest cover. And unfortunately, Cambodia also suffers from the not so pleasant title of being the country with the second greatest number of protected area downgradings, delistings, and degazettements of any country on earth. The first place goes to Brazil, but Brazil is a huge country. Cambodia is something like 1/30th of the size of Brazil. So the fact that it has almost as many downgradings and degazettements in just a 10-year period is terrifying. And we know that it has devastating consequences for the biodiversity. And if you want to see what it looks like, and I apologize you can't see the contrast here, this just has a short time period. So this was 2006, and this is 4 years later. And you can see that the area here has all been removed and turned to plantations. So given that Cambodia is a bit too far north for oil palm plantation, this is largely for rubber production. But deforestation is not the only cause of biodiversity loss for this region. As we have more people, we also require water to grow crops, and we also require power for those people because Southeast Asia is increasingly electrified. But what's the true cost of actually providing water? Well, in 1950, we had about 30% of the global average number of dams in this region. But that increased rapidly. And so in the present day, China has more than the whole world had by an order of magnitude in 1950. And if you want to see what it looks like on a map, each of those red dots is a known dam. Now, I've been doing further analysis, and this probably represents around 25 to 30% of the actual number of dams in these regions, because this is only major dams. But what does a dam mean for biodiversity? Well, the Greater Mekong sub-region has the highest freshwater biodiversity of migratory fish of anywhere on Earth. And unfortunately, when you make a dam, you generally decrease the oxygen content of the water as well as changing the temperature. And that means you have a huge loss of those freshwater fish. In fact, analysis showed that the biomass of those fish decreases by about 20%. Now, how many people here have eaten fish in the last 48 hours? Put up your hands. Well, analysis shows that in Southeast Asia, fish makes up about 80% of the dietary protein. for the whole of the Mekong subregion, so for over 56 million people. If suddenly that freshwater fish decreases by 20%, you need to get fish from elsewhere because everyone needs protein. Unfortunately, that means you're likely to have more cattle, which is higher in fat, probably full of antibiotics, so it's not as good for you. And it means further land clearance for that cattle. It also means that, hey, let's have tilapia, a fish from another part of the world, which is likely to compete with native communities as well as becoming invasive. So then we get tilapia everywhere, which means you're going to get further effects on those freshwater communities. So in terms of thinking about local livelihoods, those fishermen, it's bad. In terms of thinking about people's diets, it's bad. And it also inundates huge riparian areas, which are essential habitat for a massive number of species. It also, we know, affects over 1,200 species in just the Mekong subregion. Now, analysis also shows that making dams actually makes local populations poorer. Analysis of big dam systems like the Three Gorges Dam in China showed that 15 years later, people in the area were poorer on average than people who were away from the dam. And they'd been richer before the dam construction. So this is bad for people. And the Global Commission on Dams actually stopped the World Bank funding dams construction for about 10 years because they realized the effect it was having on local communities. Yet as I speak, there are, I think, over 700 dams being planned or constructed across this region. So it has terrible effects on biodiversity, but as actually some of Tony's early work showed, and I don't think he'll talk about it today, but you could talk to him about it later, it also causes a loss of mammal diversity on those former hilltops that have been inundated. We also see a degradation of another important ecosystem in the Southeast Asian region, the wetland ecosystems. So that includes both the direct loss from conversion to agriculture, as well as degradation. Basically, we use it for different purposes. We've lost over almost half the Southeast Asian peatlands already, and these are a unique ecosystem which has a lot of endemic species, especially as the Southeast Asian region has almost 60% of global peatlands. Unfortunately, we've already lost a lot of these systems. And this is not only bad for biodiversity, mangrove ecosystems are essential nurseries for many marine fish species, but also, as many countries found out in the tsunami, they are essential coastal buffers to protect coastal areas against these environmental disasters. Southeast Asia also is part of something called the East Australian Flyway. It's a flyway which has over 50 million migratory birds. But unfortunately, many of those species have shown recent population declines of up to 80%. And much of that is likely to be due to the loss of wetland systems. So let's have a little look at those species. So this is some analysis I've been doing with someone called Li Jia, who is based at the University of Hong Kong as well as the Sian. And we took 56 of these species and we wanted to know where they were going. So because these are species that move seasonally, we split the data into 136 different seasonal blocks depending on where these species were at different times of year. And we used that to generate a model of biodiversity. Now let's just compare this, which is the model we produced, with these red areas showing very high diversity on the Yellow Sea, as well as much of peninsular Thailand and the Gulf. And we compared it to the IUCN data that said where these species were. And we saw there was a major disparity here in the Yellow Sea. So basically, this analysis showed us that there are areas with very high diversity that are currently being underestimated by those who are meant to be telling us where to be doing conservation and research. Now, because these are migratory species, having just an average one shot of the whole year isn't very useful. So what we also did is split it into the different temporal periods that are important for these species. Because it's no good just trying to conserve it on average, because these species need to survive all year round. That means we need to conserve their breeding sites, their wintering sites, and the areas that are important during migration. And what you can see is that between these two periods, so basically in the winter they're near the equator, and then during the breeding period they move towards the poles. So we need to conserve those important habitats all year round, and unfortunately most of them are underestimated at the moment. And as we know that these are valuable areas for agriculture, we need to work a whole lot harder to make sure that we're conserving habitat during all the important times of year. Another key and underestimated ecosystem in Southeast Asia is that of karst. Now, Southeast Asia's population has been growing. Already, Southeast and Southern Asia has about half the global population. But China, where I live, uses about 60% of global cement annually. For the 1.3 billion people, they use on average 1.5 tons of cement every year. Now, that cement has to come from somewhere, and it comes from karsts. And karsts are a very important ecosystem. So across Southeast Asia, the mineral consumption is going up, but that includes about a 6% loss of karsts every year, as well as pollution and seepage from mines and heavy metal contamination. And in fact, almost every different commodity we look at, so this is all mineral exports, and you'll see Indonesia has 7th place in the world as a mineral exporter, Malaysia is 15 at the moment. But let's go back to karsts and just think for a moment about why they're an important ecosystem. So Southeast Asia has about 800,000 square kilometres of karsts, with half of that in southern China and half in Southeast Asia. But these are the global figures, and you can see they're going up massively. In fact, in just 2 years, China used more than the whole of the US in recorded history, 6.6 gigatons. So why are these important ecosystems? Well, here is a suite of different species, from bats to Trekine beetles, amphibians, various plant species, and lizards, which show really high endemismal karsts. In fact, I've just spent 3 weeks in Myanmar, and during that time we found a new gecko species. And almost every single karst you go to has its own unique species. In fact, we know of karsts in Malaysia that have more than 10 unique species, found on one karst that's only a few hundred meters. Now, if every karst has unique species and you're losing 6% of those karsts each year, and they're underrepresented in protected areas, how on earth are you meant to protect this biodiversity, these endemic species found nowhere else on Earth? So have a look at some of these newly described karst species. So these are geckos. Each of those colours represents a species found on one karst and one karst alone, found by a small number of expeditions. And all of you will have seen karsts. They're part of the Southeast Asian landscape, but they're an ecosystem which is often forgotten and highly threatened by mining. And these are all different mineral mines in China. And of course, almost all of you have a mobile phone. That mobile phone will include rare earth minerals, which probably comes from China, because these are the exports of various minerals from China and how they're growing in just a short time period. So every technology we use depends on things that come from planet Earth. And unfortunately, most of them are unsustainably mined with a growing consumption. And we need to think much more carefully about what we consume, where it's from, and how much. Because as individuals, we all have an impact. None of us is not connected with this planet. Hunting and trade has also been an increasing issue in this region. The global trade in wildlife is worth about 20 billion every year, but half of that comes from Southeast Asia. If we look at this chart, so this is all wildlife trade, you can see that number one, China, by a massive way is the destination. But number two is Thailand, and here we have Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So basically, in terms of consuming wildlife, Southeast Asia is consuming half of global wildlife. And this is a problem because many of these species are rare, locally endemic species that we have very little data on. And we need to get a lot better at protecting these species. If we look at the trafficking just in China, so each of these red dots represents somewhere where we're importing them, and we have major trade in things like pangolins, rosewoods, and a whole suite of other wildlife species. But if we look at things, so this is what we call the donut. This is something that's based on the Sustainable Development Goals. You'll see that the biosphere is the basis of everything. we cannot survive. The economy up here depends on everything below it. And unless we protect our environment and the species in it, there is no future for humanity. So before you all get too depressed about how much we're destroying this planet, let's think a little bit about how we might protect her. And the first thing we need to do is understand where species are. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Southeast Asia is a very special region. It's a global hotspot for biodiversity, as you've already seen, and of endemism. But unfortunately, it's also massively complicated. So each of these lines is a different fault or geodynamic line. And unfortunately for us who are trying to conserve biodiversity, we also see major turnover in the species across most of these lines. So basically, if you're working on biodiversity in Southeast Asia, it's complicated. We have a lot of species and the patterns of biodiversity are very complicated. But as you've already seen, it's also a global hotspot of threat. So what do we know about biodiversity in this region and how can we actually protect it? So this map shows a map of biodiversity of bats according to the IUCN. Unfortunately, if we plot political boundaries in there, you'll see that the bats are very good. They all carry their passports, they know they can't go in China, so they get to a political border and they just turn around. Unfortunately, biodiversity doesn't generally respect political boundaries. If we model where species are based on empirical data, we get very different patterns of biodiversity. And in fact, if we look in detail at the IUCN data, you can see that unfortunately what they've done is they've used these political boundaries as delimiters for where species are. So here are the bats, here are the rodents. So you can see actually there's one rodent that apparently likes being just Yunnan, despite the fact that it goes from alpine to tropical. So going back to what the real data tells us about biodiversity, unfortunately what we find is these global authorities that are meant to help us conserve the right regions are pointing out the wrong regions by oversimplifying it and making too many assumptions about where species are. Here's one for the amphibians, and actually if you go to the US, again, they use the states. So this is the amphibians of the US. This is meant to be species boundaries. Now, this is Mexico. Here is the US, so everything is at square state. And so what you see is actually in terms of conservation, the IUCN maps are hindering good conservation. So how wrong are these maps? Well, what we find is about 85% of the range boundaries, according to the IUCN, overlap political boundaries, and about 78% for mammals, but only 50% of amphibian data points fall inside the areas that are meant to be their ranges. If we look across species, you'll see for some groups here, the data from the IUCN is actually dangerous in setting the right areas to conserve. And if we plot out where they are, so here we are in Southeast Asia, the number of borders of species distributions on those political boundaries is very, very high. But we can use data in a much more sophisticated way. So these are models of species diversity based on pairing where we know species are with the different conditions at these points. So how can we use that? Well, here are 5 maps. So here you have, and you can't read it very clearly, you've got the mammals, you've got amphibians, birds, reptiles, and plants. And what we can do is model where biodiversity hotspots are, and once we have that, we can assess how well those hotspots are protected. So what I did, and if you want to read more about this, I can send you the paper, it was published earlier this year, is we can map out areas with at least 75 or 50% of the maximum number of species, and then we can work out if they fall inside or outside protected areas. Now, the first thing you'll probably notice is that the hotspots for different species aren't in the same regions. And the second thing you'll notice is that the level of protection for these different taxonomic groups varies tremendously. So if we look at the poor reptiles here, only about 10% of the most diverse areas fall inside protected areas. If we look at things like the mammals, about 50% do. So if we're thinking about are we conserving the right regions, the answer is no. We're not conserving enough areas, but we're also not always conserving the right areas. And again, we can compare compare this to the IUCN data to see how much of a mismatch there are. And what we find is, especially for things like the birds, basically the hotspots are underestimated and the diversity everywhere else is overestimated. And we can look at that in detail, and what we find is basically the IUCN makes everywhere richer, but that doesn't provide us with the targets we need to assess conservation. We can also look to see how well species are protected depending on their IUCN status, whether they be data deficient, endangered or common. And what we find is that basically, if you're in a mid-range of threats, so you're vulnerable or near threatened, you have a larger proportion of your range protected. If you're common, you're everywhere, so it doesn't matter too much if only a small portion of your range is protected. However, the most endangered, as well as the least known species, so data deficient and undescribed species, generally have a smaller proportion of their range in protected areas, meaning the rarest species are likely to get rarer. And we can also map out for each group where the most threatened species are. So we can look to see, for example, if some areas have a greater proportion of endangered species. So for example, there are more data deficient mammals in southern Tibet, Arunachal Pradesh and northern Myanmar than there are in most areas. So we can use these kinds of maps to help us protect the right areas. And we can do that from almost any group. We can also say, okay, well, I can't survey every single species because I'm one person. Can I use an indicator for biodiversity? And organisations like WWF have been very good at championing things like the panda as wonderful umbrellas and they're indicators of all biodiversity, apparently. Unfortunately, what we find is that the majority of species are not good indicators of biodiversity of other groups. In fact, even if I split the birds into different families, each family shows different patterns of diversity. So let's have a look. So this is looking at the overlap and hotspots for 50% diversity. So the best indicator, and it's still a bad indicator, are the amphibians. Now the amphibians are a really difficult group, as you'll see later, because they show very high regional endemism, meaning that I could conserve one species here, but if I go 5 kilometres that way, there's going to be a different species. So I can't conserve both in one protected area unless I'm conserving everywhere. If you go up to the 75% diversity areas, again, the amphibian hotspots overlap with all the other species, but that's generally because they're smaller. So if it's a hotspot for amphibians, it's also diverse for other groups, but it's also only giving you a small target. We can also map out things like endemism, and what we see is this small area, so this is Lao Kai, and it's a hotspot for all groups. But by and large, many of these hotspots are not hotspots across taxa. Endemism itself is also very challenging. So this is looking at different communities for amphibian species, and you'll see that different communities for each of your different amphibian groups occur in different areas. But even if we look within a family, and here each colour represents a different species, so each of these little maps is one genus. But within one genus, each colour represents one species. They don't overlap. Basically, you've had a single species going into different river basins and then being isolated in each basin. So in terms of conservation, this represents a real problem, because unless I conserve all of these areas, I can't conserve all of the species. So in terms of conservation solutions, these species are very difficult unless we get better at conserving the matrix. We can also map out how community assemblage varies. So again, this is for the bats, and this is the biodiversity patterns for different species versus climate. And we can look to see, for climate, does the climate patterns where you get different climate zones match the zones for biodiversity? And though there are some similarities, you also see very complex regions. So this is part of Vietnam, and you'll see some areas have very different communities and much higher turnover. So we can use these new tools to help us concentrate conservation on areas with unique communities, but it's still very challenging. We can also look to see how different facets of the environment contribute to biodiversity. So this is based on a model, but the area in those red zones is all about land cover. So you'll see for almost every species, how we manage land cover is a dominant characteristic of what species are likely to survive. And it's a major facet of how we're going to protect species into the future. Another important thing to consider, especially for large-ranging species, is the connectivity across the landscape, because many species can't move through these dense human-dominated landscapes. And we can use these same GIS and modelling tools to look and see how resistant that matrix is to biodiversity. And then we can use this, so this is for a whole range of different groups, with these white areas being areas that are very difficult for species to move through. And then we can say, okay, if I'm going to reconnect the landscape, which areas are going to be best for species and most cost efficient, as well as comparing it between different groups of organisms. So what we can see is that for the majority of species, some of the patterns are the same, but we can use these tools to help us actually conserve these communities more effectively. And we can use them for things like reserve planning. So by combining those biodiversity maps you saw earlier with reserve networks, we can actually try and plan out where reserves would be most efficient, what species they would work for, how do they connect things up. But developing priorities is exceedingly challenging because it's always difficult to know what level to act. Do we use endangerment as the basis for how we conserve species and define our priorities? Do we use threat, the most threatened communities? Do we use diversity, and if so, diversity of what? Genus, species, your favourite taxa? Do we use endemism, which communities have the greatest number of unique or endemic species? Do we look at cost? Well, cost has to come into it, but we can't just conserve cheap areas. Now, as I mentioned, I live in China. China has just under 20% of its land area protected, but unfortunately, almost all of that falls on the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. If we look at the tropical south, you have a tiny percent protected. So a lot of the reasons that those areas got protected are political. It's about cost. There aren't many people there, so it doesn't matter if I say it's protected and I hit my target. And unfortunately, a lot of countries have used similar metrics. So conserving areas where you don't have people might be easy, but it's not very effective. So we look at ecosystem service provision. And again, China has been using something called the ecological red line policy to make sure it conserves ecosystem services around cities. And of course, most things come down to humans in the end. If we use it, we protect it. And this has been a good way of engaging people with biodiversity, because people tend to like trying to protect things that they use. Do we look at the species level or the ecosystem level? And these are all things that come into trying to develop those priorities, and it's like juggling many balls. You can't hold them all in the air, but to conserve biodiversity, we do need to consider them. So what are the priorities for conservation in this region? Well, for one thing, we need more baseline data. When I was in Myanmar last week, most of the caves we'd been to hadn't been surveyed before. And there are many parts of Southeast Asia that are still like that. Areas where we have no baseline data for the majority of species. It's not enough to just know if we have your big carnivores there, because we know by and large they're not good indicators of biodiversity. In fact, analysis found that the big cats were the worst indicators of biodiversity of different groups. But the good indicators, things like the amphibians, are more difficult to survey and more likely to be regionally endemic. So developing rapid inventories is difficult, and we need a lot more data to help us find out which the most diverse areas are, especially for difficult ecosystems like karsts. We also need standardized protocols, because it's no good if Colin and I both decide we're going to conserve karsts, but he surveys lizards on one karst using one method and I survey bats on another. Because unless I have good standardized protocols, I can't then compare the diversity of those areas. So as a community, we have to get better at working together, at sharing data, techniques and standards so that we can actually generate sensible metrics for biodiversity that are comparable. We also need to build mechanisms that connect researchers and connect between researchers and those who actually do the management and conservation. All of you here are young conservationists. You are the future of this region's biodiversity. You are the only people, if anyone can, stop the whole of Asia becoming Java. Now, Thailand is an example that's made protected areas work. And if you talk to some of the more senior conservationists in Thailand, they will tell you when they started working here, you'd never see a gaur in a protected area. Whereas now there are areas that have good populations. There are ways of making these protected area systems work if you maintain the biodiversity. But as I showed in the first half of this talk, this area has tremendous issues with biodiversity overutilisation. So we need to make sure that information also goes to the right place. We need to work with politicians, with ministries, to make sure they have access to the data and they can actually use it to inform biodiversity decision making and protect their environment. Last year I went to the COP meeting on biodiversity in Mexico, and one event I went to was called the Like-Minded Megadiversity Countries Breakfast. And every country there went onto the stage and talked about how fantastic their biodiversity was. And Indonesia went up there and they talked about how they had so many marine protected areas. They didn't mention how their terrestrial systems were being lost. So many countries like waving their flag of biodiversity to say to the rest of the world, aren't we fantastic? But at present, they are often not making the right, they are not trying to protect it in a way that is actually protecting the biodiversity. They haven't put in place the metrics or the enforcement mechanisms to protect that diversity. And though that is changing, they need access to the data. And you are the people who are going to make sure that that happens, because you're the biologists. But if your work finishes with you publishing in a journal that they will never read, it's not conservation. You may as well write a novel, because at least people will read that. We also need to reassess where reserves are, because many reserves at the moment don't have high biodiversity. I know in the Indonesian-Malaysian region, they were all decreasing deforestation. In some areas, they were only decreasing it by a small percentage. We also need to really target vulnerable ecosystems like karsts, which we know are underprotected and being overutilised. And we need to explore mechanisms to reconnect the landscape, but also conserve the matrix. Most countries have at most 20% protected areas. So what happens to the 80 or more percentages of areas that are not protected? Why should I be able to drive across most of Myanmar and see the same weird species I see in Thailand? So we need to get much better at trying to maintain biodiversity outside protected areas. And that means not just talking to each other, not just talking to the person next to you and saying, yeah, I like biodiversity. Because unless the people who are in the real world, the teachers, the children, the businessmen care about biodiversity, nothing is going to change. So the school curriculum needs to include biodiversity components, and biodiversity has to be something everyone is passionate about. In Costa Rica, everyone cares about biodiversity because ecotourism has made them be allowed to be proud and generate an income from it. But unless we explore mechanisms to do the same thing in Southeast Asia, then there is unlikely to be a future for humanity and biodiversity. And that's a contest that unfortunately has a predictable outcome. We need to work much better with policy makers. You should all be attending meetings where you actually talk to the policy makers, even if it's difficult and you don't feel like you speak the same language. And we need to empower local community views to be the champions of their biodiversity. If you're always working against them to try and catch them taking out that species, it's always going to be a losing battle, because as soon as your funding runs out and you walk away, they will destroy your hard work. You need to work with them and make them care about it. Because if it's only conservationists who do conservation, then conservation is doomed to failure. But if we demonstrate how sustainability works and empower people to be the champions of their species and their areas, then this region does have a future for its biodiversity. And we need to collaborate across regions, across disciplines, and across society to make sure that biodiversity is protected and it works in the real world. So all of you are young, you're at the start of your careers, and you have the ability and the opportunity to make a difference to a region with higher biodiversity but higher threat than any other part of the planet. What you choose to do is up to you. It's in your hands. But the world and your opportunities are what you make them. And if you care about biodiversity, as everyone who has made the decision to be here and probably argued with parents and society about why you should be doing it rather than doing something profitable, then make sure what you do counts, because you have the capability to do so. The world is what you make it. And as I know that you care about this region's biodiversity, we should all do what we can to make our science and our work count and create a better and more sustainable future for biodiversity. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, encourage you to take it all forward, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alice Hughes, for explaining why conservation is crucial in Southeast Asia and with so much passion. And also thank you for giving your time to deliver your talk at the YCS conference. I would now like to discuss with you some of the questions that were raised at the end of your talk. So firstly, what drives you to work in conservation and where do you get your passion from?
Well, my own story started on a farm in a rural part of the UK. When I was growing up, I grew up, as probably many of you did, on a farm. I grew up with lambs and with badgers. We had the biggest badger sets in the whole of our county. And biodiversity always mattered. My favourite thing to do was go to our local woodland and look for badgers. And I grew up watching David Attenborough programmes, The Trials of Life, seeing biodiversity all over the planet. And then when I was 8, I was leaving my first school and I heard about deforestation. And despite the fact I could break a limb without crying, I was reduced to tears by seeing these fantastic communities with unique species being destroyed for no good reason. And I decided that what I needed to do with my lifetime was try and protect biodiversity. Now, I've travelled to South America, I've done a tiny bit of work in Africa, and those regions have biodiversity, but they also have a lot of people who are able to do conservation. Southeast Asia, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily have that to the same level. The ecosystems are the most threatened on Earth. I don't think there's much debate about that now when you look at the figures. But unfortunately, we still, when you look across the conservation scene, there's far too many of us, Caucasians from the West, and that isn't sustainable. It needs to be the next generation who have the skills to actually turn the science into implementable policy change. And there are organisations like FFI and YCS have done some really impressive work across this region, especially things like SMART, which Tony will probably talk about trying to manage protected areas. It's not enough. And we keep talking and saying the same thing about biodiversity and about protecting these areas. Now, unfortunately, many of the consumers of these products are in the West, though a lot are also in China. And if the consumers don't care, the demand will always be supplied. So unless we change the demand side, we're not going to change the supply side. So I care about this region because biodiversity is a part of me. I've been a vegetarian since I was 3 because I could not be. But I'm sure all of you also care about biodiversity. You feel that delight in seeing a species you've never seen before. But this is a region that unless we do all that we can, there will not be a future for biodiversity. And therefore we need more people who not only do the work, but also take it to the right place to ensure that, like other parts of the world where there are a lot of people who have actually managed to do fairly good conservation, especially as a nation we have the additional challenge that most of our forest areas are relatively small. The Amazon has high deforestation, but it has such a large area that it's largely eating around the outside. In Southeast Asia, with such high endemism, unless you protect these little bits from everywhere, you're going to lose a lot of species. And knowing where those areas are is very, very challenging. So we need really good science and to be matching that with good policy and management change. So all of you guys and an army of other people are needed to make sure that that happens.
So when a university gives a conservation research programme its full support, what is the role of that university so it can help the programme be successful?
I think that's a really good question. It's also a very challenging one. I know that SUT is a green and clean university, so the first step is probably demonstrating sustainability. So if it's easy to make sustainable choices, people are more likely to do them. So by not only having sustainably sourced food, so at this conference we're trying to minimise things like plastic, and there's as much vegetarian food as possible. But if we demonstrate it, we make it easy and we explain it, then people are much more likely to take it into their own lives. But also doing outreach so we can show local communities how to do things more sustainably and why they should care. Something that I think always stays with me is that if we do things that are unsustainable, we are stealing from our children, we're stealing from the next generation. Because if you were running a business and you run into deficit, you're going to go bankrupt. It's the same thing with biodiversity. We have limited resources. And I think if people appreciate that, because every parent cares for their children, if they realise that the decisions that they're making is actually going to limit their children's choices, they're much less likely to do it. I think also inspiring pride in biodiversity, your unique species, the beauty of nature, we can also help empower people to care. And people only conserve things they care about. So I think by prioritising and making it easy to do things that are sustainable and showing people why they should be excited about biodiversity, I mean we all are, but explaining something you're passionate about is hard unless you can engage people with it. So I think working hard to engage people as well as making it easy. I'm working in places like Skarak where there's a lot of species already, and I know that Dr. Taksin has done a lot of work at engaging local children with biodiversity. That means that in the future those children will go up caring about it. And when they become business people or managers, their decisions are more likely to take biodiversity into account. So children are the future, helping with those syllabuses is the future, but it has to be the whole of society. And I think universities can have a really good role at engaging society with biodiversity in a very positive way.
You mentioned that Southeast Asia gets much of its economic drive from rubber and palm oil plantations, hence large-scale deforestation. We don't want deforestation to happen, but at the same time we don't want the country to lose such a major part of its income. How do you suggest that we change their perspectives on deforestation for plantations, but without a decrease in economic growth?
So there's a number of different components to answering that. For one thing, the human population in general is getting more obese and less healthy. And a lot of that is because we've increased the proportion of meat and fat in our diet. Now, soybean is predominantly grown in the South American region, and that's to feed cattle. And in Southeast Asia, we have palm oil. Now, that's basically for cheap additions to human food, because generally we're consuming a lot more than we need, which is not good for us. So if we actually paid a bit more for palm oil, actually a lot of people, well, a lot of organisations that are currently using it as a cheap filler in their food would probably decide that it's not worth it because it's too expensive. So if we pay people more for a smaller quantity, we don't need to destroy huge tracts of rainforest. So you'll probably decrease demand and increase price, which means that you can maintain these communities. As I also showed with that second very complex chart, there's huge inequality. So at the moment, despite the fact you have this massive area of oil palm, the money isn't going to local producers. So if we pay them fairly and they get to produce less, we give them a better future and biodiversity a better future. But humans also need to start considering their diets. As individuals, we are often not really thinking all that much about our consumer decisions. But if instead of having meat twice a day, you had high quality meat once a day or once a week, you can actually have a smaller footprint and eat better food that's better for you. So I think as individuals, we need to take on responsibility, but we also need to pay people fairly. These areas with high biodiversity should not be so high on the Gini index of inequality. So I think that equality is actually better for everyone. but we need to consider our individual footprints and make more conscious choices, and also spread that across society. We need to mainstream biodiversity. Now, for palm oil, the major consumers are currently Europe and China. And though Europe is saying we're sourcing it sustainably, we know the RSPO is riddled with problems. Good idea, implementation is weak, so we need to strengthen the implementation so they're not deforesting new areas. So those safeguards are needed, but in general we need to be more considerate about our footprint.
So you work in the Xishuangbanna region of China. What would you suggest needs to happen to conserve this large forest area within the region?
So China is an interesting place to be in many ways. Earlier this year we've had a number of new reserves, but they're all in the temperate areas. And every time they delineate a new reserve, I get frustrated because the south, where most of the species are, is still underprotected. And in fact, we know of at least 2 government agencies that are paid to deforest the remaining unprotected forest. So that has huge implications for biodiversity. So I'd say that number one is actually securing their borders and making sure that they stop the trafficking of wildlife, because China is the number 1 consumer of wildlife, and a lot of that is for traditional medicine, which I mentioned very briefly here, but it's a massive issue because unfortunately traditional medicine there is mainstream, and much of that includes unsustainably harvested wildlife. Pangolin is the number 1 trafficked species on Earth. So education campaigns as well as stricter enforcement to protect endangered species would probably be the first thing on my list. The second thing on my list would be protecting endangered species and areas of high diversity in the south and preventing any further deforestation, because we don't have much forest left that's not protected, and if we lose much more we will not be able to sustain large mammals if they've managed to survive so far.
There was a recent article by the British news agency The Guardian that suggested to conserve biodiversity, especially in biodiversity hotspots, we should give a universal income to all those living within the biodiversity hotspots. Could you please share your opinion on this matter?
It's a very nice idea if implemented well. As many of you are probably aware, unfortunately most of the world's biodiversity hotspots also have very high corruption. So having something like that would be a great initiative, but it has to be done in such a way that there are safeguards in place that make sure that not only are the standards kept up, but the money does reach that local level. Because if those safeguards aren't in place, what often happens is the money goes elsewhere, and what was meant to be my forest was actually a rubber plantation. So it's a wonderful idea, and it mirrors the carbon taxes and REDD when developed countries were meant to basically fund the retention of forests. But if biodiversity isn't part of that from the beginning, often the standards are watered down. So developing a shared set of standards as well as a reporting standard would also be very important to make that actually workable. Because I think if you talk to anyone in the West, they would think that what was left as forest in Southeast Asia was probably there. What we see is that things are getting worse every year. And most of the world is unaware of this because there's not much reportage. So we need to get much better at making sure those safeguards and standards are in place from the outset, and that there are things like trade bans. So most of you have probably heard of CITES. So CITES is a global agreement which is basically meant to stop the trade of species internationally. Now, Laos is not so far away. Laos is a signatory of CITES, and Laos has never impounded a shipment of wildlife. In fact, there is strong evidence to suggest that the government often funds the import of wildlife because it's a great conduit to China. Now, unless we also have sanctions such as trade bans in place for countries that infringe these regulations, then again, yes, we're happy to take the money. Do we really have to do anything? Is anyone looking? So, intergovernmental agreements are important. But other than the Montreal Protocol, most of them have had huge problems. This is something that should be explored, but it's not going to be an easy ride.
How do you interact with people who have careers that are necessary to put food on the table for their family, but do so in a way that goes against biodiversity and conservation?
So one thing scientists have often said is, we're not very good at communicating with the public. And to paraphrase that, it basically means, it's not my job. Someone else will do that for me. They'll take my science and put it out there. And of course, the best representative of your own science is yourself. But I also grew up in a rural area. The UK has an issue with TB. Their solution to TB is anti-science at the moment. It's culling badgers, which if anything will make TB worse, because it makes them move more. Now, my father was a farmer, so was my mother. She is pro the badger cull. So communicating about emotive issues to those farmers is often very, very hard, because they're not ready to take on a debate from the other side. However, what's been found to be successful in many parts of the world is to use children as the vehicle for good conservation science. So Gerald Durrell was one of the starters of wildlife conservation. And what he used to do in many cases was he would talk to the children, he would educate the children, and then when the children go home, they take the message to their parents. And rather than it being some outsider talking down to you who knows nothing about the local area, it's your child who you care deeply about infusing you and actually subliminally influencing you on biodiversity. And I think, especially when working with rural communities who are often not ready to take on an outsider's view, working with children who, and other parts of respected society, such as religious leaders, can have that power because they're not seen as the opposition. With many parts of society, there isn't such a barrier, so you can go and do a public talk. But with the parts of society that are likely to be anti-science, we need to work with people who are intermediaries and bridges to carry those conservation messages to them. And in places like Tibet, working with Buddhists have prevented cultural practices like the wearing of furs, which used to cause significant biodiversity loss. So we need to find those bridges and connection points to convey messages when we are working with a less willing public, as well as working with things like the media to try and get those conservation messages out there. Now, in China, there are huge problems with wildlife trade. Because ivory has been seen as an issue which is tied with the country's status, they are now doing something about it. The reason that they actually announced the fact that they were going to ban ivory is because they think it's possible. And when I go into an airport now, there are anti-ivory signs at the customs, there are anti-ivory signs often on the plane. This is something that is being mainstreamed. And because celebrities have also said, instead of you being rich if you have ivory, you're a stupid peasant, suddenly people don't want that status. So working with the people who are able to be good role models and actually idealize what we embody can be better than us being the emissaries sometimes. But also we do need to be the one who delivers the message when we're working with children. So it depends on what you're trying to do, but finding those connection points is always going to be important.
I would also like to thank the participants for their questions. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, YCS Conference, so you don't miss out on the other 4 plenary talks. The Young Conservation Scientists Conference 2017 was hosted by Sian University of Technology, Thailand's Institute of Scientific and Technological Research, and the National Science and Technology Development Agency. And of course, this weekend couldn't have happened without the support of our funders, Technopolis at Sian University of Technology, The Mall, Nakhon Ratchasima, John Venture Capital Incorporated, and the Siam Commercial Bank. Thank you.